Author and intimacy expert Laura M. Brotherson, host of the Marital Intimacy Show, educates and inspires women to create a mutually fulfilling, intimate, and passionate marital relationship, emotionally, spiritually, and sexually.
Hi there. Welcome to the Marital Intimacy Show. My name is Laura Brotherson. Thanks for tuning in today. Well, we get to talk about marriage and such today, one of my favorite subjects. The topic of this show is Affair-Proofing Your Marriage Part 3, Dealing with Your Issues. So in our last 2 episodes, we discussed the following: being introspective, developing greater self-awareness, communicating more openly in marriage about any subject, and 3, acknowledging and discussing attractions to others with your spouse. Now in this episode and in the next one, we'll continue with the rest of our 8 ways of protecting your marriage. These include number 4, meeting each other's needs more effectively. Number 5, developing a satisfying sex life in your marriage. Number 6, dealing with personal insecurities and issues from your past. And number 7, avoiding personal relationships with others of the opposite sex while building friendships with persons of the same sex. And number 8, setting mental boundaries. So let's get started. Now, first of all, just to let you know, some of the resources that I've used for this podcast come from a couple of women who both have experienced affairs. Their husbands both had an affair. The first is Peggy Vaughn. She's the author of Preventing Affairs and the original founder of the Beyond Affairs Network. And then Ann Birch. She's the author of My Husband's Affair Became the Best Thing That Ever Happened to Me. And she's now the current director of the Beyond Affairs Network. Both of these women are members of the Smart Marriages Coalition, which I also belong to. It's a great organization for learning lots of great things about having a smart marriage and strengthening your marriage. So let's start with number 4. Work at meeting each other's needs. Now, we know no one is perfect. We know no marriage is perfect, no spouse is perfect, nor will they ever be able to meet all of our needs. But being aware of what makes each other feel loved and striving to do those things regularly is a great way to affair-proof your marriage. Every spouse is different, and each of us have individual needs. But you need to know what those needs are in yourself and in your spouse. So some homework here would be simply for each of you to make a list of the top 10 things that make you feel loved, and then work on doing those things for each other regularly. You could also get a copy of my talk on CD, Love 101, Learning to Love More Meaningfully, to go into more detail about this concept. It's interesting that in all the resources and information I researched for this, just about everybody agrees that meeting each other's needs is an important part of preventing affairs. And you know, it's an important part of just being married and being married well. So it's certainly something that we need to be sure we understand each other's needs and that we're doing everything we can to try to meet those needs. And sometimes meeting those needs is difficult, and sometimes the needs of our spouse are a real stretch for us. But this is part of what marriage is all about, and it's part of what ultimately makes marriage really a wonderful thing too. So your most important resource for meeting each other's needs is obviously going to be each other. Finding out specifically what they want and need and doing the best you can to meet those needs. But in preventing or affair-proofing your marriage, there are some common needs that come up that we want to be attentive to. Number 1 is respect and admiration. This is one of the basic needs in a marriage, and we want to be sure that we're treating our spouse with respect and admiration. You know, I remember seeing Anne and her husband Brian on the Oprah show. I had a friend call me up and say, "Laura, you've got to turn on the Oprah show. They're talking about affairs or infidelity," and so I turned it on. And it was a good show. It was quite eye-opening. I still remember one of the husbands, I don't know if it was Brian or not, explaining that one of the factors that pulled him into the affair that he had was just the way the other woman looked at him. You know, and of course they put this image of this woman looking, you know, at the camera, and she just had this wonderful look of just admiration and adoration and longing. And I thought, wow, that's a pretty big draw, especially when you think about if there's already vulnerability going on in the marriage. This is something that we can all develop by consciously thinking about the good things about our spouse and then striving to communicate that feeling through our eyes. Another need that is frequently mentioned is the concept of couples having fun together. Sometimes life gets so busy that we neglect to just have fun. And you've got to make a little time for fun and play. The routine of life needs some playfulness thrown in to keep things alive and thriving. I personally think regularly scheduled date night is a great way to do this. Related to this concept of fun is recreational companionship. It's another way to have fun together. And this can be anything that just gives you an opportunity to be together, whether it's watching a sporting event or working out together at the gym. Recreational companionship is something that is particularly brought up as being important for many men. But whether this is true in your marriage or not, you can find out by asking your spouse if that's important to them. I remember one of the women, she talked about how she previously had been kind of critical of her husband when he would sit around and watch, football or whatever. And that afterwards she was able to learn that she could enjoy sitting and watching a sporting event with her husband and not needing to be, down on him about that. She said she actually learned how to enjoy watching hockey, which I thought was a pretty amazing accomplishment. So, miracles do happen or can happen. Now, in talking about meeting each other's needs, I really like what one of the authors talked about in making sure that each person understands and takes ultimate responsibility for their own happiness and for their own behavior, and in some ways for their own needs too. It isn't fair for people to assume that the spouse of the person who had an affair just wasn't meeting their needs. Certainly we want to be doing all that we can to meet each other's needs. But we don't have to be superhuman need meters in order for our spouses to not have an affair. In talking about this concept of meeting each other's needs with my husband, he also brought up the point that it's also important to keep in mind that it's not exactly fair or wise to expect that our spouse will change in ways that might really go against their core personality in order to supposedly meet our needs. My husband and I are pretty different. We have pretty different personalities. And when we marry someone, we marry the whole package, their strengths and their weaknesses. Certainly, we hope that each of us will work to overcome our weaknesses. But if you happen to be holding out hope that your spouse will change in a real core personality trait way, then that may not be the best use of your energy. My husband may never have a wife that really likes to spend a lot of money on things like new cars because he's always kind of wanting a new car. And he may not ever really have a wife that doesn't talk so much. I mean, these are kind of core things. Now, I certainly can work on it, but, it's just not likely that I will ever be a real quiet or reserved kind of a person if that happens to be something that he feels like he needs. Nor would it be fair for me to be waiting around hoping that my husband will change in some real major ways that go against his core personality. Now, number 5 is developing a satisfying sex life in your marriage. This is related to the concept of needing to be meeting each other's needs. We need to have a mutually fulfilling sexual relationship in our marriages. And this isn't an area of marriage that can just be ignored, nor should it be an automatic excuse for having an affair either. It reminds me of a woman who, when learning about this concept that I teach of 3 dimensions of intimacy, emotional, spiritual, and sexual, she said, she basically had said, that they had a great marriage if it wasn't for sex. And she just kind of wished that that sexual dimension would just go away and then they'd have a great relationship. But you can't just ignore one dimension that you don't particularly like. They all go together, and we need to be working on all dimensions of our relationship to have a healthy, intimate, and kind of mutually fulfilling relationship. And there may be times that a spouse has to understand that sex might be an area where they are called upon to exercise a lot of patience and endurance and maybe even making some sacrifices. whether that's because a spouse is unwilling or unavailable for such intimacies due to life stressors or past traumas or other circumstances. I just don't like to see people use this as an excuse for infidelity or divorce, but nor do I like to see people ignore this vital dimension of marriage and not understand how it creates real vulnerability in a marriage for both husband and wife. You know, we've discussed this topic of strengthening our marriages sexually in the first 2 podcasts, so be sure to check those out for more specifics in this area. Number 6 is deal with personal insecurities and issues from your past. Now, this is a very important issue in marriage and goes along with the notion of being self-aware and introspective. We all have issues. We all have strengths and weaknesses. We all have areas of our personalities and such that could be improved. We all have unmet needs that we bring into marriage from our past that can also make us vulnerable to temptations and other outside influences. You know, I have personally dealt with postpartum depression and know how damaging that and other psychological issues can be in a marriage. A lot of personal weaknesses came up for me and a lot of internal reprogramming was needed for me. Ignoring our weaknesses and areas of insecurity is just not a good idea. There is much to be gained from working on our personal issues before they become destructive neon signs for us. Anne Birch, one of the authors, believed that if someone had asked her about issues from her past or what personal insecurities she might have that might be affecting her in a negative way, she thinks that that may have been something enough for her to wake up to the potential dangers that existed in her marriage. In hindsight, she did feel that her insecurities contributed to her husband's affair, and that was something she could have seen the value of looking into to prevent potential problems. Another woman who had had an affair talked about being 15 years old before she ever heard a compliment about herself. She said her dad was just not very expressive and never said anything nice about her. And she remembers hearing from a stranger that she looked pretty at age 15. And looking back, she could see that need for affirmation and validation became a hole in her heart that produced a susceptibility for her to succumb to an affair. It's interesting that there are some common childhood wounds that we may want to think through and see if they might apply to us. These come from Dr. Harville Hendrick's work, his great book called Giving the Love That Heals. Here are some of the common wounds that he talks about. Number 1, the fear of rejection. Number 2, the fear of abandonment. Number 3, feeling unwanted or unaccepted. Number 4, feelings of incompetence. Number 5, a fear of closeness or being dependent. Number 6, fear of being smothered. Number 7, fear that their needs won't be met. Number 8, feelings of not being good enough. Number 9, feeling invisible. And number 10, having a fear of disapproval. So it might be good to just kind of look through those things and think about, ponder a little bit, whether any of those might be hiding in there somewhere that might be causing a potential susceptibility to temptations. You know, we often have negative thoughts playing through our minds that can be a real Achilles heel in our marriages. If we have things like, I'm not lovable, or no one could really love me if they really knew me, if we have this kind of stuff playing in our head, then we do have an area of weakness that can affect how we behave and how we interact with our spouse and where we might be vulnerable. Working on our personal stuff and becoming more whole as a person is time well spent. I'm a firm believer in engaging in ongoing personal growth. I think we can all benefit from having kind of an ongoing personal growth program going on in our lives to help us to continue to root out our imperfections and strengthen our weaknesses. Just imagine if our spouse is seeing that we are always trying to work on our stuff and improve and get better and overcome our weaknesses. It just think about how much easier it makes it for them to be more patient with us and more willing to overlook our inevitable weaknesses. But it takes a real humility to exist in that state of continually trying to do and be better. You need to be teachable. You need to be willing to change. And a lot of people don't want to change. They want somebody else to make the changes. Let's break here, and we'll continue with this discussion in part 4 of Affair-Proofing Your Marriage. This has been episode number 7, Affair-Proofing Your Marriage, part 3, Dealing with Your Issues. So stay tuned for part 4, the final segment of this Affair-Proofing Your Marriage series, for more specific steps to safeguard your marriage from infidelity. And we'll review all 8 steps as well. See you then.